Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at the story of David and Saul, 1 Samuel chapters 18 and 19. 18 verse 1, Now it came about, when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. We're going to see two men. Now, nowadays in American culture, when you hear about two men loving each other, you immediately begin to think homosexuality. That wasn't the case back then, and it's not the case in other parts of the world. We in American culture have a tendency to think immediately think sex, and a great many other cultures don't necessarily think that way. And so I really don't think that was the case here either. By the way, if it had been, that wouldn't justify it, because we're going to see David, and not so much Jonathan, but we're going to see David doing some wrong things throughout his life. Just because David doesn't do it won't be a justification. But I don't think there's anything to talk about in this issue. Verse 2, Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. So he's going to be now part of the retinue of Saul. Verse 3, Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. You have this relationship between these two men. Jonathan seemingly is quite a bit older. David considered a very young man. And so it's almost like a father-son relationship. And so he made a covenant. Remember, when you say this, you say he cut a covenant, and that's what the Hebrew has here. It goes, you always cut a covenant. We're going to see later on the word covenant doesn't even need to be used as long as you use the word cut. It's understood. There were three types of covenants in that day. First of all, there was the suzerain covenant, a suzerainty treaty, sometimes we refer to it as, where there was a big king, he was the suzerain, and then he might have vassals, those that were inferiors to him, and the superior would bind that vassal to the superior's obligations. In other words, he sets the rules, and they have to follow. A second type of covenant would be a covenant of parity, in which you have two people of equal status are entering into a covenant, and the obligations here would be shared. A dual oath would be sworn. And then the third type would be the covenant of a patron, in which, again, there's the superior to the inferior, but the superior does take on some of the obligations for the benefit of the inferior. Now, in this covenant, verse 3, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. You would think that this would be a covenant of the greater to the lesser, and yet we're going to see them acting on the part as though they are in parity. Jonathan shows his love for David. He cuts the covenant by making, but also by giving his robe. This is seen in verse 4. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. And so what he's doing, he's treating David as though David is his social equal, when by every right, because remember, we don't necessarily think of the king back then with a palace and a crown and things like that. They didn't have all those things. Kingship was very new to them. But even so, it's an older man to a younger man, an older man who's now in an established family, an established kingly family, a young man who's the eighth of he's the last one in the line. He's at the bottom of the social strata, and yet he treats David as an equal. Verse 5, So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So not only does Jonathan show his love for David, but also the people are pleased at David's rise in status. Remember, that's not always the case. Sometimes you see somebody with a great deal of, with not too much experience that gets elevated, and the people grumble about that. They're pleased in the case of David. Verse 6, It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And it's a catchy tune, and it soon catches on, and everybody loves the tune. Well, everybody except one person. Verse 8, then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, but to me they have only ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? And so notice Saul's reaction to this is one of anger. He's upset. He's just a bit jealous. Verse 9, Saul looked at David with suspicion, our translation says, from that day on. Literally, Saul was eyeing David from that day on. Of course, it's the idea of suspicion. That's there. And so they're trying to pass on the idea that's presented in the Hebrew text. Verse 10, now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house. Now this evil spirit, remember we said before, that wasn't necessarily moral evil, but it made him feel bad. This might be God just sending a spirit to convict him of his attitude and of his disobedience. And he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand, and before you know it, the spear is being put to use. Verse 11, Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall, but David escaped from his presence, and then we notice twice. And that makes it sound like this happened on two different occasions. Verse 12, now Saul was afraid of David. Again, we see this fear coming up, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. And Saul seems to recognize that. He seems to recognize there's something he used to have that he doesn't have anymore, but that David now has that. Verse 13, therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. What do you do when you don't like somebody? You promote them. Well, what? Well, he's got his reasons for that. We'll see this in just a moment. Verse 14, David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, before we saw he feared him. It's a different Hebrew word here, so he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, and he went out and came in before them. Now, what happens in verse 17 is what we would think of as sort of an unusual turn of events. Verse 17, then Saul said to David, here's my older daughter, Merah, I'll give her to you as a wife. And he promises, or offers at least, Merah in marriage. And what he's really thinking, for Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. He's saying, look, you're fighting my battles, you're a valiant man, go out and do valiant things, and he's got an ulterior motive. In verse 18, we see David's reaction to this. He said, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be the king's son-in-law? He's really reluctant because he says, I'm not worthy to have that. And yet we find in verse 20, now Michal, by the way, what happens is that instead of being given to David, she is given to Adriel, the Meholathite, for a wife. But now there's a younger daughter. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul the thing was agreeable to him, Saul thought, I will give her to him that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Again, he's saying, well, I'll get him involved in this, and the Philistines will take him out, and then he won't be my issue again. And so he gives instructions to his servants. He commanded his servants, verse 22, speak to David secretly, saying, behold, the king delights in you, and the servants love you, everybody loves you, become the king's son-in-law. And David's answer, again, we saw this sort of hinted at earlier, but verse 23, I think, is the central passage here, where so Saul's servant spoke these words to David, but David said, is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? He looks at Saul with great esteem, and he looks at himself with light esteem. He says, I'm not in that league. Now, the servants report this to Saul, verse 24, the servants of Saul report him according to these words which David spoke, and And now we see in verse 25 the plans for a dowry. Saul then said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, except," here it is, 100 foreskins of the Philistines. You say, that's sort of yucky. Well, yes, it is. But that's, they're only going to have one. It's not, you have two hands. And there were some cultures, we know from Egyptian history, there were times that they'd fight a battle and then there would be counters that would go on and cut off the right hand of every one of the enemy, just to sort of be able to take count. Well, here it's foreskins, and that's going to be the dowry, the dowry for Michal. And again, we're told that Saul's plan is that this way David is going to die. And verse 26, he hears this, and we read that it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law before the days had expired. Now he decides to go in, and David goes out and doesn't take 100, but rather strikes 200 Philistines, and comes with this dowry. And now Saul gives him Michal, his daughter, to be his wife. And so notice you started with one daughter-in-law, you end with another. Verse 28, when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. Instead of working, it makes him now even more upset. Thus, Saul was David's enemy continually. And so the reaction has backfired on Saul. His fear is even greater, and David is still exalted. Verse 30, then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle. And it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. This is something we're going to see in the next few chapters. David acting wisely. So his name was highly esteemed. He had a name of a name. Now we come to chapter 19, verse 1. Now Saul told Jonathan his son and all the servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So now the news is out. Verse 2, so Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now, therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I'll go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I'll speak with my father about you, and if I find out anything, then I will tell you. Then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he's not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. He's pleading David's case. Verse 5, for he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance from all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? It's an argument that in Jonathan's mind it makes sense, and it would make sense that his father would listen to reason. Verse 6, it seems that that's the way it's going. Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And as far as Jonathan is concerned, everything now has been settled. Verse 7, then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly, and everything is happy. We have Saul's order for David's death that had taken place, and then Jonathan had interceded, and now there's a restoration to Saul's presence, and we think, okay, well, that's one crisis that was avoided. However, verse 8, when there was war again, David went out and fought with the Philistines and defeated them with great slaughter, so they fled before him. Now there was an evil spirit, verse 9, from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand. Everything's back to normal. And again, Saul tried to pin David to the wall with a spear, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped into the night. We're back where we started. We're back with the problem. Verse 11, then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. Notice the pattern. Jonathan had warned him previously. Now it's Michal who is warning him. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. Verse 13, Michal took the household idol. Now the word here, it's actually plural instead of singular. I'm not, but So the household idol, ha-teraphim. Maybe you can only say it in the plural. I don't know. But the last time we saw the word teraphim, or the last time we noted it, it had been used, since then. But it's not used that many times in the Old Testament. And one of the times that we had seen it had been way back in the days of Jacob, when Rachel, Jacob's wife, had stolen the teraphim, this household idol, from her father, Laban. Again, there's an issue of in-law problems. Again, there's the father-in-law coming after and trying to hurt or to kill the son-in-law. Again, well, now David had only married one of them, but there had been 2 daughters. We saw that in the extended story, and both had been offered to David, first the older, then the younger. What we have happening is that the Saul and David story is playing out the same story from Laban and Jacob so many years earlier back in the book of Genesis. And Saul is playing the part of Laban, and David is playing the part of Jacob, and Michal is playing the part of Rachel, as she deceives her father with the teraphim, with the household idol. Now, she doesn't do it by sitting on it. She does it by laying it on the bed and putting a quilt of goat's hair at its head and covering it with clothes. She makes a little David statue. Verse 14, when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. And Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me on his bed, that I may put him to death. And when the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed, with the quilt of goat's hair at its head. And this had given David enough time to escape. Verse 17, so Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? And Michal said to Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? Now, Saul had interceded for David. Now, Michal is doing it. But notice Michal says that David had threatened to kill her. Now, we didn't read about that. That doesn't mean that it didn't necessarily take place. Sometimes what you have in the narrative is you have a more full explanation of what had taken place earlier. I don't know if that is the case. Had Michal tried to stop him, or is she just covering her tracks? And my answer is I don't know. But now Michal is aiding in David's escape. And so, in verse 18, now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. Now they're still in Ramah. Naioth is probably the place in Ramah. Just means like the sheepfold, or I guess you could translate it the prophet's place. The place of the prophets. That would actually work. And so David now stays with Samuel. Verse 19, it was told Saul, saying, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David, but when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying with Samuel, standing and presiding over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they prophesied. They're messengers, but all of a sudden they're doing something out of their job description. They're prophesying. Verse 21, when it was told to Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. So Saul sent messengers again the 3rd time, and they also prophesied. And by now, Saul is saying, if you want something done right, I guess you have to do it yourself. And so, verse 22, then he himself went to Ramah and came as far as the large well that is in Seku. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And somebody said, behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah. They're at the place of the prophets. Verse 23, he proceeded there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also, so that he went along prophesying continually until he came to Naioth in Ramah. He also stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Therefore they say, and remember we saw this earlier, the same expression, but it's another reason why it's still an expression, is Saul also among the prophets? Now, notice what has happened. We had Jonathan interceding for David. We had Michal aiding in David's escape. We had David staying with Samuel. But now we have David assisted directly by the Lord, as the Lord puts his Spirit upon Saul in such a way that it brings Saul to a halt. And so throughout this section, we started off with Jonathan stripping off his own cloak and giving it to David. And then we had that first instance where Saul tried to kill David with a spear, and he's offered the daughter, he's offered Merah, and David says, well, I'm a poor man and lightly esteemed, doesn't want to do that. We saw that as a pivotal point. Then there's the second daughter, Michal, and again, Saul tries to kill David with a spear. But finally, we have just come to not Jonathan stripping off his cloak, but rather Saul strips off his clothes as he prophesies. Notice this part of the story begins with Jonathan taking off some clothes, and now Saul taking off some clothes. We have gone from clothes to clothes, and it reminds us of a covenant that was made on our behalf, in which another one had his clothes stripped off. Jesus became naked so that we could be clothed with his righteousness. And we have entered into a covenant. Can I say it this way? We have entered into a covenant of clothing, as we are clothed in his righteousness, in his knowledge, as we come to him in faith.